The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing the daily briefings. His reading glasses perched carefully on his nose, he scanned through newspaper headlines with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in the public spotlight. But today, something made him pause. His fingers tightened around the paper as he read a particular headline that made his stomach drop. Queen Kate, the future of the monarchy, blazed across the front page of one of Britain's most popular tabloids. The words seemed to jump off the page, each letter carrying weight that Charles felt deep in his chest. He set the paper down slowly, his mind racing with thoughts he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. For years, Charles had waited to become king. Through his mother's long reign, through public scandals, through personal heartbreak and triumph, he had prepared himself for this moment. The crown that now sat heavy on his head was something he had dreamed of, worried about, and planned for most of his adult life. But seeing those words, Queen Kate, brought forward fears he had kept buried deep inside. The palace halls seemed quieter that morning as Charles walked through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors. Each painted face seemed to watch him, reminding him of the weight of tradition, the burden of legacy, and the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of the throne. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he made his way to the private quarters where Camilla was having her morning tea. Queen Camilla looked up from her delicate china cup as her husband entered the room. She had been married to Charles long enough to read the worry lines that creased his forehead, the slight downturn of his mouth that indicated something was troubling him. Without saying a word, she knew that today was different from other days. "The papers are at it again," Charles said quietly, settling into the chair across from his wife. His voice carried a weariness that came not just from the morning's revelations, but from years of watching the media's fascination with the younger generation of royals. "They're already calling her Queen Kate." Camilla's teacup clinked gently against its saucer as she set it down. She had seen this coming, had felt the shift in public attention over the past months. The way photographers focused their lenses, the way headlines were written, the way people spoke about the future of the monarchy, it all pointed to one inevitable truth that neither she nor Charles wanted to face directly. The British public had always been fascinated by Catherine, the commoner who had captured Prince William's heart and transformed herself into a duchess with grace and elegance. Her every appearance was analyzed, her fashion choices copied, her interactions with children and charity work praised. But lately, something had changed in the way people looked at her. They weren't just seeing her as William's wife or Charles's daughter-in-law. They were seeing her as the future queen. And more importantly, they were eager for that future to arrive. Charles remembered the early days of his relationship with Camilla, how the public had struggled to accept her after Diana's death. The journey to gain approval had been long and difficult, marked by careful public appearances, charitable work, and gradual acceptance. Now, as king and queen consort, they had finally found their footing, finally felt secure in their roles. But the Queen Kate headlines threatened to undermine all of that progress. The irony wasn't lost on Charles that history seemed to be repeating itself. Just as the public had once been impatient for him to take the throne from his mother, now they appeared eager for the next generation to step forward. The difference was that this time, Charles wasn't the young prince waiting in the wings. He was the aging king watching his relevance potentially slip away. Camilla reached across the small table and placed her hand over Charles's. Her touch was warm, reassuring, but couldn't completely ease the anxiety that had settled in his chest. "They don't understand the constitutional process," she said softly. "William is next in line, not Catherine. They can't simply skip over you or him." But Charles knew it wasn't about constitutional law or lines of succession. It was about public perception, about where people placed their hopes and dreams for the future of Britain. And increasingly, those hopes seemed to rest not with him and Camilla, but with the younger, more glamorous couple who represented change and modernization. The palace staff moved quietly through the halls, carrying out their daily duties while carefully avoiding any mention of the morning's headlines. They had learned over the years to read the mood of the royal family, to sense when discussions were better left unspoken. Today was clearly one of those days. As Charles sat in the quiet morning light, surrounded by centuries of royal history, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would change everything. The Queen Kate headlines weren't just newspaper sensationalism. They were a window into the public's heart, showing where their loyalties truly lay. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as Charles contemplated a future where his own reign might be seen as nothing more than a brief intermission before the real show began. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere in Clarence House was thick with unspoken tension. Queen Camilla sat in her private study, surrounded by correspondence and official papers, but her mind was elsewhere. The morning's conversation with Charles had left her feeling unsettled in a way she hadn't experienced since the early days of their marriage. She understood all too well what those Queen Kate headlines meant, not just for Charles, but for her own position within the royal family. Camilla had spent years building her reputation from the ground up. After the devastating public reaction to Diana's death and the subsequent blame placed on her relationship with Charles, she had worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of her eventual role. Every public appearance had been carefully calculated, every charitable endeavor chosen to show her dedication to the British people. The transformation from the other woman to beloved queen consort had been neither quick nor easy. Now, as she read through the latest batch of newspaper clippings her private secretary had prepared, Camilla could see the writing on the wall. The headlines weren't subtle in their preference. "Kate's common touch wins hearts," read one. "The People's Princess, Why Catherine Represents Modern Britain," declared another. Each article seemed to chip away at the foundation she and Charles had so carefully built. The comparison to Diana was inevitable, though it stung every time Camilla encountered it. Catherine had managed to achieve something that had eluded Camilla for decades: instant public adoration combined with media protection. Where Camilla's every move had been scrutinized and often criticized, Catherine's actions were celebrated and praised. The younger woman had mastered the art of royal duty while maintaining an air of accessibility that the public craved. At Kensington Palace, Catherine was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around the morning's headlines. She was focused on her children's afternoon activities, helping Prince George with his homework while keeping an eye on Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis as they played in the garden. The normalcy of family life provided a stark contrast to the media frenzy surrounding her future title. William had seen the headlines, of course. As second in line to the throne, he was acutely aware of how public perception could shift the dynamics within the royal family. He knew his father well enough to understand how those Queen Kate articles would affect him. Charles had always been sensitive to public opinion, perhaps too sensitive at times, and William could imagine the conversations taking place behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace. The prince found himself in an impossible position. He loved and respected his father, wanted Charles's reign to be successful and meaningful, but he also couldn't ignore the clear message the media was sending about public preferences. The British people seemed ready for change, ready for a younger, more relatable royal family to take center stage. And that desire for change was being projected onto his wife in ways that made William both proud and concerned. Catherine noticed her husband's distraction as they sat down for dinner with the children. His usual engaged presence was replaced by a distant look, the kind he got when royal duties weighed heavily on his mind. She had learned over the years to read these moods, to know when to press for details, and when to simply provide supportive silence. "The headlines today," William said quietly after the children had been tucked into bed. He didn't need to elaborate. Catherine had learned long ago to stay informed about media coverage, even when it made her uncomfortable. She had seen her face plastered across newspapers with titles that made assumptions about her future that she wasn't ready to contemplate. "I didn't ask for any of this," Catherine replied, settling beside her husband on their comfortable sofa. "I married you, not the crown, not the expectations and projections of what people think I should become." William took her hand, feeling the simple gold band that had started their journey together. "I know, but perception has a way of becoming reality in our world. The more they write about Queen Kate, the more people will expect it to happen soon." The irony of their situation wasn't lost on either of them. Catherine had spent over a decade learning royal protocol, understanding her role as a supporting player in the monarchy's grand theater. She had mastered the art of being visible enough to fulfill her duties while staying in the background enough not to overshadow the reigning monarch. Now, that careful balance was being upset by forces entirely beyond her control. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Charles was pacing in his private office, a habit he had developed during times of stress. The evening news had picked up the morning's headlines, expanding the story into a full segment about public opinion polls and the future of the monarchy. Every channel seemed to be discussing the same theme: the British people's excitement about Catherine's eventual queenship and their impatience with the current pace of royal succession. The polls were particularly troubling. When asked about their preferred future for the monarchy, a significant percentage of respondents expressed hope that William and Catherine would take on greater roles sooner rather than later. Some even suggested that Charles should consider stepping aside to allow the younger generation to lead, though such suggestions showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how royal succession actually worked. Camilla joined Charles in his office, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing an expression of determined calm. She had spent the afternoon making her own calls, speaking to trusted friends and advisors about the situation. The feedback she received was consistent. The Queen Kate phenomenon wasn't going away anytime soon, and the royal family needed to find a way to address it without causing further damage to their own positions. "We need to be smart about this," Camilla said, setting down the tea and taking a seat across from her husband. "Getting defensive or trying to compete with their popularity will only make us look petty. We need to find a way to embrace their success while maintaining our own dignity and authority." Charles nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "It's not about competing with them. It's about the fundamental question of whether the public sees any value in our reign at all, or if they're simply waiting for us to move aside." The conversation that followed would shape how the royal family approached the growing Queen Kate narrative. They knew that their response, or lack thereof, would determine not just their own legacy but the future stability of the monarchy itself. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had never been smaller. The following morning brought an emergency meeting that would never appear on any official palace schedule. In a small conference room tucked away from the main corridors of Buckingham Palace, Charles's most trusted advisors gathered around a polished wooden table. The mood was serious, the kind of gravity that only emerged when the very foundation of royal authority seemed to be shifting beneath their feet. Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, had prepared a comprehensive briefing on the media situation. Charts and graphs showed the dramatic spike in positive coverage for Catherine compared to more neutral, sometimes critical coverage of the king and queen consort. Social media analytics revealed an even starker picture. Posts featuring Catherine received significantly more engagement, more positive comments, and more shares than any content featuring Charles or Camilla. "The numbers don't lie," Sir Clive said, his voice measured but concerned. "Public enthusiasm for the Duchess of Cambridge has reached unprecedented levels. More concerning is the narrative that's developing around the idea that she represents the future while Your Majesty represents the past." Charles listened in silence, his hands folded carefully in his lap. He had requested this meeting not because he wanted confirmation of what he already knew, but because he needed to understand the scope of the challenge they were facing. The Queen Kate headlines weren't an isolated incident. They were part of a larger shift in public consciousness that threatened to undermine the very basis of his authority as king. The palace's head of communications, a sharp woman named Sarah Morrison, had prepared her own analysis of the media landscape. Her findings were equally troubling. "The narrative has moved beyond simple admiration," she explained. "We're seeing think pieces about modernizing the monarchy, opinion columns suggesting that Catherine represents the kind of queen Britain needs for the 21st century. The implication is clear. The current leadership is seen as outdated." What made the situation particularly challenging was that Catherine herself had done nothing wrong. Her conduct had been exemplary, her public appearances perfectly executed, her charitable work genuinely impactful. She couldn't be criticized or reined in without the palace appearing petty or threatened. Any attempt to diminish her role would likely backfire spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of internal royal drama that the media thrived on. At Kensington Palace, Catherine was experiencing her own form of pressure. Invitations for public appearances had increased dramatically in the weeks following the Queen Kate coverage. Organizations that had never shown interest in royal patronage were suddenly eager to be associated with her name. Fashion designers were sending increasingly elaborate offerings, hoping to dress the woman the public saw as the future queen. Most challenging were the direct approaches from political figures and influential business people who seemed to view her as the real power within the royal family. These individuals would make comments during public events that suggested they saw her, rather than Charles, as the person who could really make things happen. Such conversations put Catherine in an impossible position. She couldn't openly correct these assumptions without seeming disloyal to her father-in-law, but neither could she embrace them without overstepping her constitutional role. William was watching his wife navigate these treacherous waters with growing concern. He could see the stress building in her shoulders, the way she held her smile a fraction too long during public events, the careful calculation in her responses to questions that had previously been straightforward. The woman who had once moved through royal duties with natural grace was now second-guessing every word and gesture. "They want to make you into something you're not," William told her one evening, as they reviewed her schedule for the upcoming month. "They're projecting their hopes for change onto you, regardless of whether that's fair or realistic." Catherine looked up from the calendar, exhaustion evident in her eyes. "The hardest part is that I can't even defend myself without making things worse. If I say I don't want to be seen as Queen Kate right now, it sounds like I'm rejecting the role entirely. If I embrace the attention, it looks like I'm trying to overshadow your father." The impossible nature of Catherine's position was exactly what Charles feared most. The public's enthusiasm for her was forcing the royal family into a corner where any response seemed wrong. If they celebrated her popularity, it implied that the current monarchy was lacking. If they tried to manage or reduce her profile, it would create exactly the kind of family drama that had plagued the royals in previous decades. Back at Buckingham Palace, the strategy session was reaching its most crucial point. Charles needed to make decisions about how to handle the Queen Kate phenomenon without destroying either his own authority or the family's unity. The options presented by his advisors were all fraught with risk. One proposal involved leveraging Catherine's popularity by giving her more high-profile roles and responsibilities, essentially embracing the public's desire to see her take a leading position. The theory was that by appearing to welcome her increased prominence, Charles could seem magnanimous and forward-thinking. However, this approach risked accelerating the very process he was trying to control. Another suggestion was to increase Charles and Camilla's own public presence, flooding the media landscape with positive coverage of their work and achievements. This strategy aimed to remind the public of the current monarchy's value, while not directly confronting Catherine's popularity. The danger here was that it might create an obvious competition that could split public opinion and create visible tensions within the family. The third option, favored by more traditional advisors, involved a subtle reduction in Catherine's public profile, achieved through careful scheduling and delegation of her appearances to less prominent events. This approach would theoretically allow Charles and Camilla to reclaim media attention without appearing to deliberately sideline the popular Duchess. However, such a strategy risked creating exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes drama that the British media loved to expose. As the meeting stretched into the afternoon, Charles found himself facing the reality that there might be no perfect solution. The Queen Kate phenomenon had revealed a fundamental challenge to his reign that couldn't be managed away through clever public relations or careful scheduling. The British people had decided what they wanted the future of their monarchy to look like, and that vision didn't necessarily include a long and prominent reign for Charles and Camilla. The weight of this realization settled over the room like a heavy blanket, as the assembled advisors waited for their king to make a decision that would shape not just his own legacy, but the future of the institution he had waited his entire life to lead. The decision that would change everything came during a private dinner at Windsor Castle, 3 weeks after the first Queen Kate headlines appeared. What was meant to be a quiet family gathering to celebrate Prince Louis's birthday became the setting for a conversation that would reshape the dynamics of the British monarchy for years to come. Charles had spent those 3 weeks wrestling with his advisors' recommendations, watching the media coverage intensify rather than fade away. International newspapers had picked up the story, with headlines in American and European publications speculating about the future of the British royal family. The Queen Kate phenomenon had transcended simple celebrity gossip to become a genuine discussion about the direction of one of the world's oldest monarchies. Camilla had noticed the change in her husband during those weeks. The confident king who had finally stepped into his lifelong role was being replaced by someone who seemed constantly on edge, second-guessing decisions that had once come naturally. The joy he had found in finally being able to serve as monarch was being overshadowed by fears about his relevance and longevity. The birthday celebration itself was a study in careful family diplomacy. Catherine had chosen her outfit with particular care, elegant enough to be appropriate for dining with the king and queen, but not so stunning as to draw attention away from the birthday boy. Her interactions with Charles and Camilla were warm but measured, each conversation carefully navigated to avoid any topics that might touch on the media coverage surrounding her future role. William found himself watching the subtle dynamics between his father and wife with growing concern. Both were clearly making an effort to appear natural and relaxed, but the underlying tension was palpable to anyone who knew them well. The easy family relationship they had built over the years was being strained by external pressures that none of them had directly created. Prince George, now old enough to understand some of the complexities of royal life, had recently asked his mother why the newspapers kept calling her Queen Kate when his grandfather was already the king. Catherine's explanation, that newspapers sometimes wrote about things that might happen in the future, had satisfied the 10-year-old's curiosity, but the question lingered in her mind as a reminder of how the situation was affecting even the children. As the evening progressed and the children were taken upstairs for bed, the four adults found themselves alone in the comfortable sitting room overlooking the castle grounds. The formal dinner had given way to coffee and quiet conversation, but everyone could sense that something significant was about to be discussed. Charles was the first to break the careful politeness that had characterized the evening. "We need to talk about the elephant in the room," he said, setting down his coffee cup with a gentle clink. "These headlines, this Queen Kate business, it's affecting all of us, and we can't continue to pretend it isn't happening." Catherine felt her stomach tighten. She had dreaded this conversation while simultaneously knowing it was necessary. "I want you to know that I've never encouraged any of this coverage. I've been trying to handle my duties exactly as I always have." "We know that," Camilla interjected quickly. "None of us think you've done anything inappropriate. But the situation has developed beyond anyone's control, and we need to decide how to handle it." What followed was the most honest conversation the four of them had ever shared about the realities of royal succession and public expectation. Charles spoke openly about his fears that his reign would be seen as merely a transition period, that the public's eagerness for Catherine to become queen implied dissatisfaction with his leadership. Camilla expressed her concerns about her own hard-won acceptance being undermined by the obvious preference for a younger, more glamorous future queen. William found himself in the difficult position of supporting his father while also defending his wife. "The public's enthusiasm for Catherine doesn't mean they reject you, father. It means they're excited about the future of the monarchy. That should be seen as a positive thing." But Charles's response revealed the depth of his insecurity. "Is it positive when that excitement seems to come at the expense of respect for the present? When every article about Catherine's future queenship implies that my reign is something to be endured rather than celebrated?" Catherine had remained largely quiet during this exchange, but finally spoke up with a directness that surprised everyone in the room. "What if we're looking at this all wrong? What if instead of seeing the public's interest in my future role as a threat, we saw it as an opportunity to strengthen the monarchy as a whole?" Her suggestion sparked a discussion that would continue late into the evening and fundamentally alter how the royal family approached the Queen Kate phenomenon. Instead of trying to manage or minimize the public's enthusiasm, Catherine proposed embracing it while clearly defining the proper constitutional framework. "The public doesn't really understand the difference between being queen consort in the future and having any actual power now," she explained. "Maybe our response should be educational rather than defensive. We could use this interest to teach people about how the monarchy actually works, about the importance of continuity and constitutional process." Camilla was the first to grasp the brilliance of Catherine's approach. "You're suggesting we turn the media attention into a positive narrative about the monarchy's stability and future, rather than letting it become a story about impatience with the current leadership." The strategy that emerged from that evening would require careful coordination and impeccable timing. Rather than fighting against the Queen Kate narrative, the royal family would strategically embrace it while consistently reinforcing the constitutional reality that any future queenship was still years or even decades away. Charles would increase his own public profile, but in a way that positioned him as the mentor and guide preparing the next generation for their eventual responsibilities. Camilla would take on a more prominent role in supporting Catherine's development as a future queen, creating a narrative of continuity and collaboration rather than competition. Most importantly, Catherine would begin speaking more openly about her future role, but always within the context of supporting the current monarchy and learning from Charles and Camilla's example. The message would be clear. She was honored by the public's faith in her future, but she understood that her time to lead was still far off. As the evening concluded and William and Catherine prepared to return to Kensington Palace, there was a sense that a corner had been turned. The Queen Kate headlines would continue, but now the royal family had a plan for managing them that strengthened rather than threatened the monarchy's unity and stability. 6 months after the first Queen Kate headlines appeared, the landscape of the British monarchy had transformed in ways that no one could have predicted. The strategy developed during that pivotal evening at Windsor Castle had not only worked but had created something entirely new in royal public relations, a narrative of seamless generational transition that strengthened rather than threatened the institution. Charles had discovered something unexpected during this period. Embracing his role as mentor to the next generation had actually enhanced his own authority rather than diminished it. His public appearances now included frequent references to preparing William and Catherine for their future responsibilities, positioning him not as someone waiting to be replaced, but as a wise leader ensuring the monarchy's continued success. The king's confidence had returned as he realized that the public's excitement about Catherine's future queenship could coexist with respect for his current reign. During a particularly successful state visit, foreign dignitaries had commented on the strength and stability of the British monarchy, noting how smoothly the transition of responsibilities was being managed across generations. Camilla had perhaps experienced the most dramatic change in her public perception during this period. By positioning herself as Catherine's mentor and supporter, she had transformed from a potential rival into a bridge between the past and future of royal womanhood. Her years of experience navigating royal protocol and public scrutiny made her an invaluable guide for Catherine, and the media had begun celebrating this mentoring relationship as evidence of the monarchy's wisdom and continuity. The Queen Consort found particular satisfaction in teaching Catherine the subtle arts of royal diplomacy, how to handle difficult conversations with foreign leaders, how to represent British interests while maintaining political neutrality, how to use royal influence for positive change without overstepping constitutional boundaries. These private lessons had become public knowledge through carefully managed media access, creating a narrative of preparation and responsibility that the public found reassuring. Catherine herself had grown into her role as the acknowledged future queen with remarkable grace and intelligence. Instead of being overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her, she had used the Queen Kate attention as an opportunity to deepen her understanding of royal duties and expand her areas of expertise. Her public statements now regularly referenced the valuable guidance she was receiving from Charles and Camilla, creating a picture of unified family purpose. The Duchess had also begun taking on more substantial responsibilities, but always within the framework established by the current monarchs. Her increased profile was presented not as impatience for power, but as appropriate preparation for future service. When she spoke at major events or met with world leaders, it was always as William's wife and Charles's daughter-in-law, never as someone attempting to bypass the established order. William had perhaps faced the most complex navigation during this period, balancing loyalty to his father with support for his wife while managing his own position as heir apparent. He had discovered that his role as interpreter between generations was both challenging and valuable, helping his father understand Catherine's perspective while ensuring his wife understood the constitutional constraints she faced. The Prince of Wales had also stepped up his own royal duties, taking on more of the ceremonial and diplomatic responsibilities that had traditionally fallen to the monarch. This increased activity served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the smooth functioning of royal succession. It prepared William for his own future kingship, and it allowed Charles to focus on the aspects of monarchy that most interested him while delegating other duties to capable hands. The children had adapted to the increased attention with remarkable resilience, aided by their parents' careful management of their exposure to public life. Prince George was beginning to understand his own future role, but within the context of a family working together rather than competing for attention. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis remained largely shielded from media scrutiny while gradually being introduced to the realities of royal life. The media response to this new royal dynamic had exceeded everyone's expectations. Instead of creating division or highlighting tensions, the family's coordinated approach had generated overwhelmingly positive coverage. Articles that had once focused on competition between royal generations now celebrated the monarchy's successful adaptation to modern expectations while maintaining traditional values. International coverage had been particularly favorable, with foreign publications noting how the British royal family had managed to evolve without losing its essential character. The Queen Kate phenomenon had been transformed from a potential crisis into a success story of institutional adaptation and family unity. Behind closed doors, the relationship between Charles and Catherine had deepened into something approaching genuine friendship. The king had come to appreciate his daughter-in-law's intelligence and dedication, while Catherine had developed real respect for Charles's wisdom and experience. Their public interactions now reflected this authentic warmth, creating a powerful image of family harmony that resonated with the public. Camilla and Catherine's relationship had become one of the most positive aspects of the entire transformation. The two women had discovered that they shared many interests and concerns, and their mutual respect had grown into genuine affection. Public appearances featuring both women together had become highly anticipated events, symbolizing the successful integration of past and future royal traditions. As the royal family looked toward the future from this new position of strength and unity, the Queen Kate headlines that had once threatened to tear them apart had instead taught them valuable lessons about adaptation, communication, and the importance of presenting a united front. The crisis that could have divided the monarchy had instead made it stronger, more cohesive, and better prepared for the challenges of the 21st century. The British public, which had initially seemed impatient for change, had discovered that they actually valued stability and continuity even more than novelty. The royal family's demonstration that they could honor both tradition and progress had renewed public confidence in the monarchy's relevance and future. What had begun as a threat to royal authority had become proof of the institution's enduring strength and adaptability.